Lucio Okubia is fleeing from a farmer who caught him in the act of stealing crops. Driven by the need to survive, Lucio resorted to theft because his father is gravely ill. On his father's deathbed, he makes a heartfelt request for Lucio to look after his older sister. Lucio vows to find a way to support them both. The following day, he decides to rob a bank. When he approaches the bank employees for money, they refuse to comply. In a moment of desperation, he brandishes a knife and threatens them. However, his fear overwhelms him, causing him to lose control. The staff allows him to leave, advising him to return home. Upon arriving home, his sister embraces him and informs him that their father has passed away. The next day, Lucio is taken aback to see his sister packing. She explains that it's time for him to enlist in the military, as all boys must serve for a decade starting at age 13. Though he is reluctant to join, his sister insists it is crucial for his future. With some hesitation, he agrees. Fast forward 10 years, and Lucio is now an adult living in Paris. He visits the apartment he provided for his sister while he was in the military. He tells her he left the camp due to poor food and has not completed his service. She is disappointed that he quit so close to the finish line. She is now married to Patrick Kane, an accountant based in Paris. Lucio expresses a desire to work with Patrick, but due to his lack of education, Patrick can only offer him a position as a construction worker. Eager for the opportunity, Lucio accepts the job. On his first day, he overhears fellow construction workers discussing anarchism, the idea of a society without government. Intrigued, Lucio claims to support it, even though he doesn't fully grasp the concept. The workers invite him to help distribute anarchist flyers and learn more about the ideology. He becomes captivated by it, viewing anarchism as his newfound calling. That night, he allows Kiko, a friend of a friend, to stay at his apartment. Kiko shows up with a massive suitcase filled with firearms and is on the run as a notorious bank robber. Lucio admires Kiko's daring nature and feels a rush of excitement when Kiko invites him to join in on a bank heist the following day. However, during the robbery, Lucio's old anxieties resurface, causing him to lose control once more. Kiko comforts him, assuring him that feeling nervous is completely normal, and encourages him to remain composed and focus on maximizing their haul. They manage to escape just before the police arrive. Kiko reveals that the money they stole will support anarchist initiatives and assist struggling families. Lucio begins to see himself as a contemporary Robin Hood. A few days later, they plan another heist and enlist Lucio's friend Ostiello to drive them. During the robbery, Ostiello leaves the car running, which catches the attention of a police officer. Kiko and Lucio make a hasty retreat, firing at the police vehicle as they flee. The police launch an investigation and raid their hideout, but Lucio is released later due to a lack of evidence. The bank manager recognizes Lucio's voice as similar to that of the robbers. Lucio never encounters Kiko again and later learns from the newspaper that Kiko has passed away. Heartbroken, Lucio resolves to honor Kiko's legacy by continuing his mission. Together with Ostiello, he robs another bank and uses the proceeds to purchase a small printing press. Lucio hires Sean to manage the operation. Two women, Anne and a student involved in the anarchist movement, place an order for brochures. Anne invites Lucio to a demonstration on campus. Having developed feelings for her, Lucio attends the event, is captivated by her speech, and invites her to join his anarchist group. While they converse, a riot erupts. Lucio takes Anne to a riverbank and confesses his identity as an anarchist and bank robber, explaining that his aim is to aid the less fortunate, much like Robin Hood. She finds his honesty intriguing. Their bond deepens and they start dating. At the printing press, they all watch news coverage of the US attacking Cuba. Frustrated by the situation, Sean proposes that they use the printing press for a more significant cause. Lucio makes the decision to print counterfeit currency to support Cuba. He enlists the help of Patrick and Tamita's brother-in-law, who has been out of work, and shares his scheme to produce fake money, offering him a job in the process. Patrick agrees and they begin the operation of printing bills. Lucio then exchanges these counterfeit notes for real cash, distributing the funds to impoverished anarchist families. During this period, Anne reveals her pregnancy, which brings immense joy to Lucio. The following day, he heads to the Cuban embassy with his strategy to undermine the US economy by inundating the market with counterfeit dollars, potentially triggering an economic crisis. The officials at the embassy are intrigued and suggest he go to the airport the next day to meet directly with the Cuban prime minister. At the airport, Lucio presents his plan to the prime minister, who acknowledges the creativity of the idea but expresses skepticism about a small nation like Cuba being able to effectively challenge the might of the US. Lucio feels disheartened by the Prime Minister's lack of faith. Just as he is about to leave, a frantic man rushes over to inform him that the police have caught wind of their operation. An inspector and his team are on the lookout for him. In a bid to escape, Lucio scatters money into the air to create a diversion, using the ensuing chaos to slip away unnoticed. He changes his appearance to avoid detection, but the inspector sees through his disguise and commands his officers to encircle him. Lucio is apprehended and taken to jail. Months later, he is released from incarceration. Filled with joy, he rushes to see Anne, who has just welcomed their daughter into the world. 8 years go by and Lucio has turned his life around, now working as a construction worker and steering clear of any illegal activities. One day, his foreman hands him a check as payment. Unfamiliar with checks, Lucio is pleased to learn that they can be cashed at a bank. After finishing work, he picks up Anne and their daughter from school. Now married, Lucio and Anne volunteer at the school together. While shopping at the supermarket, Lucio realizes he doesn't have enough cash to pay for their groceries. The cashier tells him that he can use a check for payment. As he realizes the simplicity of using a check, his old criminal instincts begin to resurface. Later that night, he meets with Sean Patrick and Ostiello at the printing house. He suggests a new scheme to forge checks from Citibank, a prominent international bank known for its lax check security. He thinks it will be easier to produce counterfeit checks since the penalties for forging private items are less severe than those for state property. The group agrees to the plan and starts working on the checks. After several attempts, they manage to create convincing counterfeit checks. Lucio tests one at a bank and successfully cashes it without any problems. Though pleased with the outcome, he decides to proceed with caution. He plans to spread the task of cashing the checks across various cities in France to complicate police tracking. He instructs the group to cash the checks at the same time. The operation goes off without a hitch, and the money is allocated as before, some for protests, some to aid struggling families, and the remainder for themselves. However, weeks later, Citibank uncovers the counterfeit checks. They send a bank manager named Barrow to report the fraud to the French police, dismissing their efforts as sluggish. The inspector, feeling insulted, assures Barrow that he will quickly locate the culprits, as he already has a lead. The following day, while Lucio is picking up his wife and daughter from school, the inspector arrives and shows him a fake check. The inspector inquires if he created the check. Lucio calmly denies any involvement, claiming to be a reformed man and an ordinary construction worker. After responding, Lucio rushes home, feeling upset after overhearing a conversation. His wife is disappointed that Lucio has returned to a life of crime without informing her. Despite his attempts to justify his actions, she disagrees with him. She believes there are better ways to make a positive difference, such as her offer to volunteer as a nurse in Bolivia. She proposes that he leverage his skills to assist in developing the infrastructure there, but he declines. Even when she threatens to take their daughter to Bolivia, he remains steadfast in his decision. That night, the team gathers at the printing house. They tune into the radio and learn that starting tomorrow, French banks will only cash one check per day. Jan suggests they halt their operations to protect other anarchist members from potential danger. He proposes selling the counterfeit checks overseas. Lucio remembers a former inmate from prison, Charlie, and decides to reach out to him for help in locating a foreign buyer. The following day, Lucio meets with Charlie, who agrees to assist in finding a buyer. A few days later, Charlie introduces Lucio and Ostiello to Tony, a prospective buyer from America. Tony offers to purchase the fake checks for $1 million but needs 2 days to arrange the funds. Lucio resolves to sell the checks and then travel to Bolivia with Anne to evade police detection. He sets up the transaction to occur at a restaurant in 2 days. Upon returning home, Lucio discovers his sister, Patrick, and Jen in his apartment, all visibly shaken and convinced they are being followed by the police. His sister is furious, blaming Lucio for dragging Patrick into his illegal activities. Frightened of the police, Jan decides to back out, while Anne expresses her frustration at his selfishness. On the day of the deal, Lucio notices a police car surveilling his apartment. He asks Anne to help distract the officers, but she refuses and hands him a plane ticket, bidding him farewell. Lucio creates a scene to draw attention away and manages to slip away unnoticed. At the restaurant for the transaction, Lucio spots Ostiello waiting, but as Tony arrives, the police swoop in and arrest him. In prison, Lucio meets with his lawyer and angrily accuses someone of leaking his plans to the authorities. The lawyer informs him that Patrick has escaped and is suspected of betraying him. Stunned by the betrayal, Lucio discovers that Barrow, the manager at Citibank, has launched a heavy lawsuit against him. If Barrow's demands are fulfilled, Lucio could face up to 20 years in prison and a staggering $50 million fine. Filled with desperation and regret, Lucio anxiously awaits his trial. Just before proceedings are set to begin, his attorney requests a delay due to errors in the documentation. Barrow, frustrated by the setback, fears that this postponement might give Lucio a chance to evade justice, but the judge has no option but to approve the delay. Lucio is granted parole until the next court date. Meanwhile, French newspapers label him the Robin Hood of France, much to Barrow's irritation. Barrow insists that the inspector take severe action against Lucio, but the inspector finds himself powerless against the judge's ruling. The following day, Lucio encounters Patrick at a bar, visibly upset. He confronts Patrick about his perceived betrayal. Patrick defends himself, explaining that he was approached by a police officer who offered money for information, which he declined, fearing it would only escalate the situation. To safeguard his family, Patrick had taken his wife out of town until things calmed down. Realizing he misjudged Patrick, Lucio begins to question who the true traitor is. Later that night, his lawyer pays him a visit and reveals that it was Charlie, not Patrick, who had betrayed him. Tony, the potential buyer, was actually an informant for the American police. Charlie collaborated with Tony to frame Lucio. The lawyer also warns that the trial is fast approaching. Restless and unable to sleep, Lucio receives a threatening call from an unknown number, warning him that he will be killed if he does not surrender. He approaches the inspector, suspecting Barrow's involvement, but the inspector can only assist with solid evidence. Nonetheless, he agrees to back Lucio, as he harbors a dislike for Barrow. With this newfound support, Lucio hurries to the cemetery to retrieve his counterfeit check prints. He resolves to play along with Barrow's scheme. At night, he produces as many counterfeit checks as he can and distributes them among all the members of his anarchist group. He instructs them to sell these checks to tourists throughout France, aiming to disrupt the international banking system. A few days later, his scheme bears fruit. Barrow receives a call alerting him that the fake checks are now circulating worldwide. Realizing that Lucio is behind this chaos, he finds himself in a tough position. Meanwhile, Lucio, using a public phone, calls Anne and expresses his regret for not being able to join her in Bolivia, assuring her that he will make it there soon. As they speak, the police arrive and arrest Lucio for his role in distributing counterfeit checks globally. At the police station, he encounters Barrow and calmly suggests a deal. He offers to surrender all the counterfeit check prints and cease his operations if Barrow drops the lawsuit and pays him a certain amount. Lucio warns that if Barrow declines, the fake checks will keep circulating, resulting in financial losses for Citibank. With limited options, Barrow reluctantly agrees to his demands. The following day, Lucio and Barrow meet at a hotel, where Lucio hands over the counterfeit checks. Barrow asks him to assure that he will not produce any more fake checks. Lucio agrees to stop printing but does not provide any guarantees, knowing that Barrow has no choice but to trust him. After finalizing the deal, Jan and Ostiello find Lucio in the hotel lobby, excited to see him free and triumphant against a formidable adversary. A few days later, Lucio reunites with Jan in Bolivia. She is ecstatic to see him. He promises that even though his anarchist group in France has been disbanded, his fight is far from over. He is resolute in continuing his struggle, convinced that anarchism is his true calling.